Lord Ulan Ashford quietly seethed in anger as he stalked through the hallways of his family's ancestral manor with his guard captain and the merchant boy following behind him. When one of his town guards came running into the dining hall yelling about the sea cutter sailing toward the town while being covered in strange creatures, Lord Ashford had not known what to think. He had promptly sent some guards to take his family somewhere safe and then gathered his men and formed a makeshift militia as quickly as possible, expecting to fight off some kind of invasion, but those expectations proved false. Instead, he found himself astounded when he learned that the merchant ship he'd sent to Northrend had brought these spider creatures willingly to his shores and that they were some kind of diplomatic delegation. It certainly didn't help things that the creatures were from some kind of kingdom of giant spider people, and that they looked like the kind of monsters he would expect to find eating a peasant. Forcing the monsters to stay on the ship was as much for their benefit as it was for his. There would almost certainly be an uncontrollable panic among the townspeople if those things were to go strolling through the streets. A part of him wanted to turn around immediately and pull the full story out of the weaselly little merchant, but he just knew that this story was one that his advisors would need to hear as well. Thankfully, it didn't take long for them to reach his council's meeting room, and Lord Ashford was pleased to see his advisors already waiting for him. Father Elric, a white-haired man in his older years of life, immediately ceased the conversation that he was having with House Ashford's seneschal, Warren Claridge. Lord Ashford stormed into the room without acknowledging the both of them and quickly made his way to take his seat at the end of the long table that sat in the middle of the room. As he sat down, he could see the merchant boy, Oscar, and guard captain, Gunnar, follow in behind him and stand behind one of the chairs around the long table, waiting patiently for him to give them permission to sit. Lord Ashford glared silently at the merchant for several moments, watching him squirm, before giving everyone permission to sit in their respective seats. Seeing no reason to delay the meeting while his docks were infested with monstrous spider people, Lord Ashford decided to start speaking immediately after everyone was seated. "Explain to me now, in detail, what those creatures are and why you decided it would be a good idea to bring them to my lands without permission," said Lord Ashford, his voice steely as he directed his question to the merchant. "Well, you see, it's a bit of a long story," Oscar said nervously, cringing back from his gaze. "Under most circumstances, I would tell you to take a deep breath and take as much time as you need, but I'm afraid these are not most circumstances," said Father Elric, his voice kind yet firm. "Please explain the situation as best as you are able so that we might make the best decisions we can for the people of Fairwater." "Right, of course," said Oscar, calming down slightly. "Well, I suppose it started when we arrived at Moki Harbor and greeted the Tuskar chieftain." What followed was an unbelievable tale that Lord Ashford would expect to hear from a bard with an overactive imagination. A giant underground kingdom that spanned half of Northrend? Wealth and resources that rivaled that of Quel'Thalas? Silk strong enough to lift buildings? A race of spider-like creatures with a variety of different shapes and sizes? Fully trained warriors that were only 4 years old? Any one of these things was enough for Lord Ashford to scoff in disbelief, if not for the fact that he had seen both the creatures and the spatial bag filled to the brim with gold and gems with his own eyes. First, there are rumors that Stormwind has been destroyed by an army of otherworldly creatures, and now a group of spider monsters have sailed into my port. What is the world coming to? This is quite concerning, said Father Elric. Especially if the news of Stormwind's destruction at the hands of unknown creatures proves to be true. These are already chaotic times for the Eastern Kingdoms, even without the introduction of these Nerebians. Stormwind has been destroyed? What happened? Oscar said in shock. I thought they were dealing with a rebellion at most. Bit more than that, and now we are dealing with this, said Guard Captain Gunnar gruffly. And if these creatures prove to be hostile, we ain't got anything that can deal with a mage strong enough to flat out stop a volley of bullets with a wave of his hands. Lord Ashford's expression darkened at the reminder. House Ashford had sent a request to Dalaran through Lord Ron's House of Lords for a mage to advise them on matters of magic, but they were apparently low priority for such things. Ever since the War of the Seven Thrones that resulted in the official dissolution of the Arathorian Empire and the complete destruction of House Ashford's lands, and the fort that was once their namesake, their house had been much diminished. They had tried many times throughout the years to rebuild their house to its former glory, but they had not had much luck. Lord Ashford dearly wished that he had someone by his side who could give him counsel, but the only mage who was affiliated with their house was his second son, who was currently studying in Dalaran. If Oscar's claims in regards to the vast wealth of these people are accurate, then this could be a great boon for your house, my lord, said Warren, his expression thoughtful. Trading with the walrus people is one thing, said Guard Captain Gunner, a hint of disgust in his tone. But I ain't really interested in watching these bug people skitter in and out of town. The light can be found in all creatures of this world, said Father Elric reproachingly. And these people have shown that they are willing to be diplomatic, which is better than the troll-like beings who brought ruin to Stormwind. It would behoove us to treat them with kindness until they prove themselves unworthy of our trust, despite their unfortunate appearances. If I may, Oscar said hesitantly, interrupting the discussion. I should make it clear that their diplomatic delegation has only come here with the intention of establishing diplomatic contact with the Eastern Kingdoms. Their kingdom is quite isolationist, and I doubt that they would be willing to agree to any long-term trade agreement until after they meet with House Menethil. Then why should I entertain allowing them to travel freely through my lands? Asked Lord Ashford irritably. If he couldn't make some gold by playing nice with the monsters, then why would he risk the safety of his people by letting them off the ship? There are a few reasons, my lord, beyond the fact they are already paying us quite the sum in gold and goods just for bringing them here, said Oscar, sounding more confident now that he was now speaking on more familiar ground. Firstly, just because they are not willing to sign a trade agreement with us now, does not mean that will always remain the case. It may happen that the relationship between the Crown and Azjol Nerub develops in a favorable direction, with your name attached due to that success, and if that is the case, then both Fairwater and your house will be in an incredibly advantageous position to benefit. That was certainly true. House Ashford was in the best position to benefit from trade with a large kingdom from Northrend, given that they already had experience sending ships there. The only other town that might benefit as much was Stratman. They were located much further away. Secondly, Oscar continued, the Nerubians intend to travel to Capital City as quickly as possible, and have no desire to stay in the town for very long. That was a good point as well. The idea of sending the monsters on their way and making them somebody else's problem was an appealing idea. And finally, said the merchant, his tone becoming more hesitant, I should point out that I do not believe that you have much choice in the matter, my lord. The Nerubian delegation includes multiple powerful mages as well as a powerful being known as a Spider Lord. Having had the opportunity to get to know these people, I do not think they would react well if you attempted to stop them. Lord Ashford bristled at the idea that his lands were too weak to prevent the monsters from doing as they pleased, but he forced down his indignation and accepted the reality of the situation. He glanced at his guard captain, but the man just shook his head, indicating that he also thought that they had poor odds. From there, the meeting mostly resolved around matters of logistics and how they could get the creatures out of their town as quickly as possible. They decided to send one of their fastest riders to Capital City in order to warn the Crown about the situation. At the insistence of Father Elric, they even decided to send an escort with them that would act to make certain that nothing unfortunate happened along the way. It'll also be wise to make certain that the things don't go running off into the countryside and start eating peasants, Lord Ashford thought cynically. I don't envy House Menethil right now. Things in Capital City are about to reach a boiling point, given that the creatures will arrive around the same time that the rulers of the other human kingdoms do. He was suddenly pulled out of his musings by the sound of someone knocking on the door to the meeting room. Enter, Lord Ashford called out immediately, worried that the monsters had done something that required his attention. As soon as he called out, the door opened and one of his guards walked through. My lord. The militia has been thrown into a panic by some kind of massive monster on the ship. Massive monster? He must be talking about the so-called Spider Lord. Lord Ashford had looked at the ship through a spyglass and seen some of the monsters infesting it, but he had not gotten a good look at the Spider Lord. According to Oscar, the thing was a confidant of the ruler of their kingdom and had been sleeping in a giant silk cocoon throughout the trip. Lord Ashford immediately got up, strode out of the room, and started making his way to the docks with his advisors following close behind him. If something tragic happened because the militia was panicking and they did something stupid, then the consequences for his people could be catastrophic. When he reached the docks, the first thing he saw was a bunch of panicked men yelling and pointing their weapons toward the docks. Calm down, you fools. Are you men? Or are you a bunch of cowardly children who lose your discipline the moment you see something that frightens you? yelled Lord Ashford, his voice carrying over the crowd and causing the men to cease their hysteria. It took several more moments for Lord Ashford to finish calming down his men, but he eventually managed it and decided to turn his attention to the creature that had caused them to panic. He could immediately understand why the mere sight of the creature, and the thought that they might have to fight it, would strike fear into the heart of men. Upon the deck of the ship was a massive monster that stood at a height greater than 3 fully grown men and looked like some kind of disgusting combination of a beetle and a spider. It possessed a thick scarab-like carapace that was predominantly blue but held a gold color around its edges. Instead of having hands like the others of its kind, the Spider Lord seemed to only have 2 scythe-shaped arms, as if to make clear that the monster's only purpose was the application of violence. It also had a single large horn protruding from its forehead that he was sure was more than capable of skewering a fully grown man, and its 4 eyes were calmly staring at him with a disturbing amount of intelligence. "By the light," whispered Father Elric in awe. The rest of his advisors were not doing much better. Lord Ashford ruthlessly pushed down the shudder that wanted to flow through his body and wrenched his gaze away from the creature and turned it to the man he had left in charge, demanding a report on what had happened while he was gone. Apparently, after he had left, the ship had been safely docked and the monsters began freeing the Spider Lord from its cocoon. His men followed his instructions and escorted the ship's captain and all of the sailors off of the ship and then interrogated them about what happened while they were in Northrend. Their stories were consistent with what Oscar had told him and there was no evidence of any of the men being harmed. The 2 members of the Explorers League that had paid him to travel along with his ship had been a wealth of information. In particular, after he was finished receiving the report, Lord Ashford made his way over to the 2 spider mages that he had spoken to earlier while deliberately ignoring the gaze of the Spider Lord, who turned to follow his movements. "I have finished consulting with my advisors," said Lord Ashford, directing his statement to the one that Oscar had identified as the more friendly of the 2. Despite technically being in charge of the delegation's diplomacy, the one Oscar referred to as Vizier Haedix was apparently not particularly interested in talking to them. "We will finish speaking on this matter at my manor. The rest of your people will continue to remain on the ship until we reach an agreement." The 2 of them immediately broke out into conversation, speaking some kind of strange chittering language. Lord Ashford was not able to read the expressions of the hideous creatures, but he was certain that he could sense an arrogant disdain radiating from the taller of the 2. The Spider Lord also joined the conversation with a voice that sent a wave of dread running down his spine. Fortunately, the other one was indeed as diplomatic as Oscar had claimed. "Of course, Lord Ashford," said the monster that was named Krivax. "The 2 of us would be more than willing to discuss this matter with you so that we might reach an accord." Its common was strangely accented and a bit rough around the edges, but disturbingly good given the amount of time that it had been learning it at sea according to reports. After giving the creature a stoic nod, Lord Ashford turned and began leading his council and the 2 mages back to his manor, painfully aware of the gaze of the Spider Lord on his back the entire time. Krivax was extremely glad that the ceilings of noble manors in Azeroth were apparently built high enough for him to fit inside, although just barely. He doubted that he would fit inside one of the houses that belonged to the normal townspeople, but it seemed that rich people loving large houses was a multiversal concept. Though he had been forced to bend down through a few doors, Vizier Haedix simply cast a short-range teleportation whenever he reached an inconvenient doorway. They started the meeting through a round of introductions, each of them stating their various positions. Vizier Haedix showed an expression of interest once the kind-looking older man was introduced as a priest of the Church of the Holy Light, but he otherwise seemed bored and indifferent to the humans. "I have been told by Oscar that you wish to travel to Capital City in order to meet King Terenas, correct?" asked Lord Ashford as soon as everyone was properly introduced. "Yes, Lord Ashford, that is correct," said Krivax. In his past life, Lord Ashford was the kind of man that Krivax would have found intimidating, but it was hard to be afraid of a person when they were just so much smaller than you. That and the fact Krivax could throw magic at people now. "Good, then I will organize some of my men to escort you and your people to Capital City," Lord Ashford said decisively. If Krivax still had eyelids, then he would have blinked in confusion. Well, that was easy. Maybe Oscar got through to them and they are feeling more friendly toward us, thought Krivax, feeling hopeful. "That way you can make due haste through my lands as quickly as possible," said Lord Ashford, crushing Krivax's growing optimism. "Oh, Vizier Haedix let out a derisive chuckle but otherwise did not comment. Krivax had hoped to form some kind of friendly relationship with House Ashford given that their port was one of the most convenient for travel between the Northrend and the Eastern Kingdoms, but he doubted Lord Ashford was interested in such a thing at this time. Maybe later when the shock of their sudden arrival wore off he would be more open-minded.
"We understand, Lord Ashford," said Krivax politely.
"We will leave for Capital City as quickly as circumstances allow. Thank you for allowing us passage through your lands."
"If I may, I would like to join your escort," said Father Elric amiably. "I believe I could help smooth over any difficulties in your initial meeting with Capital City's authorities, and I would enjoy the opportunity to learn more about your people."
Krivax was a bit surprised by the priest's offer, but he did not have any problem with it. "Vizier Haedix, should we take him up on his offer?" asked Krivax while speaking Nerebian. "Yes," Haedix said immediately. "I would like the opportunity to study the magic that these humans refer to as the light."
"We accept your offer," said Krivax, earning a smile from the priest.
"Excellent," said Father Elric warmly. "I look forward to it. I am worried that the guards of Capital City are likely quite on edge given the current circumstances, so I am pleased that I will have the chance to smooth over any ruffled feathers." "Current circumstances?" asked Krivax, feeling a sense of foreboding. "Oh, please excuse me. I forgot that you are new to these lands," said Father Elric, his tone apologetic. "People are saying that Stormwind, a human kingdom far to the south, has been destroyed by an army of strange creatures and its remaining people fled here to Lordran not long ago. King Terenas has called for a meeting with the other human kingdoms to figure out how to respond to such a threat." "Oh, how convenient," said Vizier Haedix, speaking in Nerebian. "It significantly will streamline our efforts to have all of the human rulers in one city. Just be sure not to say that in common where the humans might hear you, Vizier," Krivax hurriedly pointed out. "They might take offense." Vizier Haedix scoffed but did not refute him. It did not need to be said that they were also strange creatures as well, and the guards of Capital City would be tense given their state of heightened security due to having so many foreign rulers visiting. Vizier Haedix suddenly seemed much more interested in the meeting and began asking questions about Stormwind and what they knew about the creatures that had destroyed it. Krivax tried his best to listen to the conversation, but it was hard when his attention was consumed with the news that he had just heard. Ever since Oscar had told him that King Lane was the current king of Stormwind, he had believed that he would arrive in the Eastern Kingdoms during the First War, but he now knew that the First War had just ended. Now, the Second War was about to begin, and the Lich King would be created shortly afterward. Krivax did his best to ignore the frightened stares of the residents of the human town of Brill as the Nerebian delegation and their armed and mounted escort made their way through the small human settlement. Father Elric had indeed saved them all a lot of trouble by moving ahead and warning the locals of their approach. They were still fearful, of course, but the word of a priest of the Church of the Holy Light held great sway over the citizens of Lordran. The priest had saved them a lot of time and trouble, and they were now expecting to reach Capital City by the end of the day. Krivax was a bit surprised by how quickly the trip had gone, but perhaps it only felt that way given that he had been lost in his thoughts through most of it. Those thoughts mainly revolved around figuring out what the hell he was going to do about the upcoming Second War. Considering that the Alliance was already fated to win the war, there was always the option of just sitting back and allowing things to play out as they did in canon, but there were many problems with remaining uninvolved. That didn't even include the fact that the butterfly effect was likely to change things significantly due to their very presence, and he had no idea how it could change the results of the conflict. It was a relief to learn that he had a few years that he could use to prepare before the creation of the Lich King, but there were still many dangers that he needed to consider. Even if Krivax was to ignore the morality of allowing so many people to die when he had the opportunity to make things better, there was also the fact that he wanted the Alliance to retain as much of their strength as possible to confront future crises. Not to mention the fact that Deathwing was currently active during this time period, and that his battle with the Aspects would result in him retreating to Deepholm until he returned in an explosion of power that reshaped the landscape of Azeroth. If Krivax wanted to avoid the cataclysm, then Deathwing could not be allowed to survive the events of the Second War as he did in canon. But that's easier said than done. Try as he might, he could not come up with a plan that could guarantee the death of a being as insanely powerful as Deathwing. Despite having written down and doing his best to memorize everything he could remember about Warcraft lore, the moment he realized where he was, there were many things about the lore that he simply never learned or could not remember. He remembered that Deathwing spent much of the Second War sowing chaos while disguised as a human noble, but he couldn't remember for the life of him what name Deathwing used as a human. Krivax had a good overview of the events of the war, but there were many smaller details that he wished he knew. And even if he did know about the big events, what would be the best way to go about changing things for the better? Krivax knew that he wanted to prevent Alexstrasza, aspect of the Red Dragon flight, from being captured and taken to Grimbatol, but how? He could potentially tell Crossus, who was a member of the Council of Six of Dalaran at this time and also secretly a Red Dragon, about the threat to his queen, but how would he justify his knowledge? He doubted that a mage as powerful as Crossus lacked the ability to track him down if he tried something as simple as sending an anonymous letter. Maybe I could revisit the idea of pretending to be a seer? Or maybe I could just tell someone the truth? Krivax had chosen before not to pretend to be a seer because he felt like there was a high likelihood that it would backfire on him. He could easily imagine a scenario in which he was sent to train with Azjol-Nerub's actual seers and he ended up landing in hot water once he failed to replicate their abilities. After all, his knowledge of the future was static and would grow less and less accurate over time. But the idea of simply telling someone the truth, or even a modified version of it? The only person he trusted enough for something like that was Masrook. Krivax knew his friend well enough that he was certain that Masrook would keep his secrets. Unfortunately, his friend was no more able than him to solve Azeroth's numerous problems. There was also still a risk of the knowledge being compromised even if Masrook didn't tell anyone. While mind magic was by no means common, it was not non-existent either. After joining the Order, Krivax was learning how to protect his mind from both the void and mind magic, but Masrook did not have such luck. The members of the delegation who knew sensitive information either possessed an artifact that could shield their minds, or had the ability to do it themselves, but Masrook had neither. Still, it might be worth the effort to find a solution, even if only to get another perspective. Plus it would be nice if I could share this with somebody else. He considered whether or not he was willing to bring this matter up with Haedix, who was fully capable of protecting his own mind, and was surprised to find that the answer was not an immediate no, although it was not a yes either. Vizier Haedix was both arrogant and ruthless, but the more Krivax got to know him, the more he believed that the Vizier was genuinely striving for the good of their people, and mainly only their people. His life would be much easier if he could share what he knew with Vizier Haedix, but he couldn't help but worry about his reaction. Krivax pushed away these thoughts and decided to turn his attention back to the present. His thoughts were too chaotic right now, and from what he knew about the timeline he still had some time before he had to make any major decisions. Lord Ashfort had been true to his word when he said that he would organize an escort to lead the delegation out of his lands as quickly as possible. It was not long before the Nerubian delegation, the two members of the Explorers League, Father Elric, and a small group of mounted knights provided by House Ashfort, could be seen leaving the town of Fairwater. While the trip had gone by quickly, it had also been depressingly quiet given that the humans were not interested in speaking to them, and the Nerubians in general not being one for small talk. It didn't help that Trixie had not taken it well when she learned that Stormwind had been destroyed and that the army of creatures responsible for it would likely soon turn their attention to Kaz Modan. For all that she knew, Gnomergan was already under siege and her family could be in danger while she had no way to help. Krivax glanced down at Trixie, who was visibly depressed as she walked next to Muzzy, before pulling his gaze back up. Surprisingly, the only people who seemed to actually be interested in making conversation over the past few days were, through a translator, Father Elric and Anuba Khan. Krivax glanced at the extremely strange pair as Vizier Krenus translated Father Elric's words as he explained the philosophies of the Church of the Holy Light to an interested Spiderlord. Anuba Khan would interject at times to ask pointed questions about the Church's history and its relationship with the various human governments, all of which Father Elric was more than happy to answer. "Have you finally pulled yourself out of your thoughts?" asked Masrook, who was walking by his side. Yeah, said Krivax, feeling embarrassed that he had mostly ignored his friend while thinking about the future. "Sorry about that, Masrook." "Good," said Masrook with a note of relief. "This trip has been dull and these humans are proving far less interesting than the Tuskar.
Not a single one of them is willing to spar with me. Well, I'm not sure what I can do to help with that, said Krivax with a hint of amusement. We won't be stopping again until we reach the city, and it's not as if I can spar with you while we're moving. Let's hope that there are some people in the city who are willing to offer you your daily dose of violence. Yes, let's hope, Masrook agreed immediately before turning to look at Trixie with a worried expression. The tiny one has not been willing to spar with me either. Apparently, Trixie and Masrook had sparred a few times while Krivax had been undergoing the process of becoming a vizier. He was sad that he had missed the chance to see his friend running around with his spear after being shrunk down by Trixie's shrink ray. Yeah, she's just a bit sad because she's worried about her family, said Krivax. I don't understand, said Masrook, uncomprehendingly. I have not even thought of the rest of our clustermates since we were designated to our roles. Her relationship with her family is much closer to the relationship between the two of us, said Krivax, explaining it the only way he knew how. I would be sad and upset if you were in danger, Masrook, especially if I couldn't do anything to help you. Masrook's expression became one of contemplation as he thought over what Krivax had just said. We should attempt to raise her spirits, Masrook said decisively. Krivax was a bit surprised at his friend's words, but he quickly agreed. Hello, Trixie, how are you feeling? Krivax asked with concern after walking over to the gnome and her dwarf companion. Hello, tiny one, we are here to lift your spirits, said Masrook straightforwardly. Trixie glanced at the two of them but did not show any other outward reaction. Unless you can protect my family from the army of monsters that are heading their way, then I doubt there is much you can do to lift my spirits, said Trixie, her voice monotone. Krivax winced at her words. He did remember that the Horde was not successful in their attempts to siege Gnomeregan and Ironforge, but they did still manage to conquer most of Cars Moden. What city does your family live in? Asked Krivax considerately. In Gnomeregan, like most gnomes. Why? Asked Trixie, tilting her head in confusion. How long do you think it took for the monsters to destroy Stormwind? Krivax continued, trying to lead her to the correct conclusion. That merchant boy said he'd been hearing rumors of trouble down there for at least the past few years, Malzy offered quickly, likely seeing where he was going with his line of questioning. If it took years for the beasts to beat Stormwind, then they aren't going to have an easy time taking Ironforge or Gnomeregan. And it's also likely that Stormwind managed to weaken them significantly, said Krivax consolingly. Do you really think that's true? Trixie asked Malzy with a hint of hope in her voice that was previously absent. Yeah, lass, I do, Malzy reassured her. Remember, I've got family in Ironforge too. I wouldn't give you false hope if I didn't believe it myself. Even if the beasts manage to take Cars Moden, they aren't stepping foot in Ironforge or Gnomeregan anytime soon. I'm sure our people are already hunkering down and getting ready for a fight. Trixie seemed to shudder before taking in a deep breath and releasing it slowly, doing her best to calm herself down. You guys are right, Trixie said firmly. Gnomeregan isn't going to go down without a fight. I'm sure my family will be all right until help arrives. That's the spirit, lass, said Malzy approvingly. No sense in worrying ourselves over much before we know more. Besides, said Krivax, I'm sure the human kingdoms will come together and fight back these creatures given that the kingdom that was destroyed was one of their own. Trixie and Malzy glanced at each other with dubious expressions. I'm not so sure about that, Trixie said hesitantly. Unlike gnomes, humans aren't exactly the best at getting along with one another. I'm afraid she's right, Malzy agreed reluctantly. In my experience, there's nothing that a human hates more than other slightly different humans. Not that my people are all that better. Krivax already knew that the human kingdoms would eventually come together to form the alliance, so he was not all that concerned about the matter. The four of them spent the next hour talking while walking down the path to Capital City about the various human kingdoms and their differences. Krivax noted that the frequency of people traveling on the road being shooed away by either their escorts or Father Elric was steadily increasing as they drew closer to Lordaeron's capital. Unfortunately, Krivax was pulled out of the conversation by the sound of someone calling loudly for him in Nerubian. Vizier Krivax. He turned to look at Vizier Krenis, who was gesturing for him to approach while walking beside Anubakan and Father Elric. Krivax quickly excused himself and made his way over to the Vizier, who was looking thoroughly irritated. Yes, Vizier Krenis? How can I help you? Asked Krivax as he approached. I am done translating for these two, Vizier Krenis said adamantly. Speaking about the light was perhaps interesting for the first day, but after 5 days I have long exhausted my interest in the topic. You will take over for me. Krivax looked at the vizier with exasperation before turning his gaze to Anuba Khan and Father Elric, who were both watching him with expressions of amusement. Of course, Vizier Krenis, said Krivax, resigned to his fate. While he was in the same caste as her, Vizier Krenis was much older and much more powerful than he was, so unless Vizier Haedix said otherwise he was expected to naturally defer to her orders, and his mentor didn't seem to care either way. Excellent, said Vizier Krenis, before hurriedly walking away in the direction of Vizier Haedix. Huh? So you're the hatchling that turned Azjol-Nerub upside down, Anuba Khan said with interest as he stared down at Krivax. Ah. Yes, I suppose that is me, Spider-Lord, said Krivax cautiously. He remembered Anuba Khan as a creepy raid boss from Warcraft, so he couldn't help but feel a little wary of him. It didn't help that this was their first time actually having an actual conversation, given that the Spider-Lord had been asleep while on the ship and Krivax had stayed away from him during their journey from Fairwater. There's no need for the formality, little vizier, said Anuba Khan, huffing in amusement. Just call me Anuba Khan. I'm not particularly interested in titles or things like that. Krivax was staggered by the Spider-Lord's lack of formality. Nerubian culture in general places a high value on certain conventions, such as referring to those above you by their proper titles, so he was more than a little surprised by Anuba Khan's relaxed attitude. It didn't fit at all what he had expected from him. Krivax looked at the Spider-Lord warily as he tried to think of an appropriate response. However, before he could, he was interrupted by Anuba Khan's chittering laugh as his mandibles rapidly clicked together. If you have a question for me, then ask, little vizier, said Anuba Khan once he finished laughing. Yes, Spider-Lord, Krivax said politely. It's just, I've never heard of a Nerubian as powerful as you being so casual? Finished Anuba Khan as Krivax trailed off. Yes, Spide. Krivax interrupted himself as the Spider-Lord stared pointedly at him. Yes, Anuba Khan. The difference between me and every other member of the higher caste that you have met is that I have nothing to prove to anyone, Anuba Khan said bluntly. I have no cities. I hold no political positions. I simply go where my High King tells me to go and do what he tells me to do. Perhaps there are some who would continue to worry about the respect of others in my position, but I have never seen the point. I guess it makes sense when he lays it out like that. Besides, continued the Spider-Lord, it's easier not to care about other people's opinions when you're perfectly aware that you can kill everyone around you at any time. Ah, that makes even more sense. But enough about me, hatchling, said Anuba Khan, turning his attention back to the human priest who seemed more than willing to wait patiently as they finished their conversation. Ask the human why he has been so willing to share information about the light. I could not imagine a vizier sharing as much about their magic as he has over the past few days. Krivax didn't hesitate to dutifully relay the Spider-Lord's question. The light is not something that should be hoarded and kept secret, as if I were some mage from Dalaran, said Father Elric, sounding mildly insulted. The light belongs to all creatures of this world, and the farther it is spread, the safer we all are under its benevolent protection. This light seems like it would be useful to our kingdom, although it would be a challenge to find those among our people suited to it, said Anuba Khan consideringly. Still, it might be worth the effort if it meant accessing an easy source of healing magic. Krivax spent the next few minutes translating between the two of them before the conversation was suddenly interrupted by Anuba Khan. Looks like our little watcher is getting ready to leave, said Anuba Khan. Krivax looked around in surprise but failed to see anyone watching them. In the sky, hatchling, said Anuba Khan while pointing one of his scythe-like arms to a specific portion of the sky. There is a human watching us from above while riding some manner of winged creature. They were clever enough to paint the creature's armor so that it blends naturally into the sky. Krivax looked directly in the direction the Spider-Lord was pointing but was only barely able to spot the griffin that was flying away from them. It had blue armor and many of its wings were white, so it was difficult to notice the creature unless he knew what he was looking at. How were you able to notice them? Krivax asked in disbelief. Simple. I heard them, Anuba Khan said smugly.
My hearing is sensitive enough to pick out a heartbeat from the other side of a cigarette. They have been watching us for a while and are likely leaving to report to their human leadership now that we are close to the city. Krivax was not sure how to respond to that, so he just asked the first question that came to mind. Can all Spider Lords hear that well? If they could, then Krivax would need to be careful about what he said and where he said it once he returned to Azjol-Nerub. No. I am quite special, said Anuba Khan, sounding very self-satisfied. Krivax waited for the strange Spider Lord to continue, but he seemed content to leave it there. After that, it didn't take long before they could see Capital City in the distance. The city itself sat on the north shore of Lordamere Lake and seemed to be gleaming in silver and white. The first thing Krivax thought was that the city felt peaceful, yet also powerful. The humans of these lands are much more advanced than the ones in our lands, said Anuba Khan as he assessed the city. Unfortunately, they did not have long to admire Lordaeron's capital city before they were approached by what looked to be nearly 50 mounted knights wearing full sets of blue and white armor. Many of the soldiers were fidgeting nervously and were gripping tightly onto their weapons, but each and every one of them held an expression of grim resolve that made it clear that they were willing to die for their kingdom if it became necessary. They have even more soldiers prepared nearby, said Anuba Khan approvingly. Smart. They would need them if they wished to face me. Father Elric quickly stepped forward to meet the man who seemed to be the leader of the soldiers and began to speak quietly with him. Lordaeron was obviously already aware of their coming given that a messenger had been sent ahead and a griffin rider had been watching them, but it was still helpful for Father Elric to help calm down their nerves. Krivax glanced at Vizier Hadix, wondering if his mentor intended to take charge of the diplomacy now that they were about to speak to representatives of the most powerful human kingdom in the Eastern Kingdoms, but the vizier's expression remained as uninterested as ever. Krivax then glanced at Anuba Khan, but immediately remembered that the Spider Lord could not speak common. Krivax didn't even bother glancing at Vizier Krenez, walking forward while feeling a sense of resignation. Once he was done speaking to Father Elric, the leader of the soldiers directed his horse to step forward so he could address the Nerubian delegation. The man wore a crimson cloak over a polished breastplate and had gold traceries in his armor and spoke with a commanding voice. I am Captain Falric, leader of the Kingsguard of Lordaeron. When the messenger from House Ashford told me of your approach I had not believed him. Who here speaks for your delegation? A moment of silence passed before Krivax moved forward to speak for the group. I do, Captain Falric. I am Vizier Krivax of Azjol-Nerub, said Krivax. We have come to your city with hopes of speaking to King Menethil about forming a diplomatic relationship between our kingdoms. Then you've either come at the worst or the best time to do so, Captain Falric said grimly. For as it stands, representatives of all 7 human kingdoms are now being hosted in King Menethil's court, discussing how best to combat the growing danger that is known as the Horde down south that has already destroyed Stormwind. When word first reached us of your arrival, some assumed you to be affiliated with them until it was made clear you were. Very different from the creatures that make up the Horde. He finished while looking over the Nerubian delegation's various members, all castes represented before him besides a queen. This is our people's first time setting foot on this continent, said Krivax. We hold no desire to threaten the people of these lands. I will hold you to that, Nerubian, said Captain Falric, his voice full of steel. The representatives of the various kingdoms have been informed of your arrival and are prepared to meet you. I will warn you only once, any hostile actions against anyone in this city will be dealt with severely and swiftly. With that said, Captain Falric directed his men to surround their delegation, taking over the role of the knights from House Ashford. Once everyone was in position to separate the delegation from any onlookers, it wasn't long before the captain called for them to start moving and the Nerubians were taking their first steps through the gates of Capital City.